Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are in round 7 of our coverage of the 2020 Candace Tournament. Winner of this tournament does go on to face Magnus Carlsen at the World Championships later this year. Our competitors today in round 7 just happen to be the top 2 players at the top of the leaderboard. In second place coming into this game is MVL. He is playing the white pieces. Remember, he's only in this tournament because someone dropped out. He's been trying to play in the Candace Tournament for some time now. Finally got his chance, trying to prove himself in this tournament. He is 1 full point behind Jan Nepomniachtchi, and he's playing the black pieces, having an outstanding tournament playing the black pieces in this tournament. So we'll go ahead and get started with MVL. Starts out with E4. And then E6, you hate to see it. The French defense, just something when I play E4 a lot. Always hate running into the French defense. D4, D5, getting into the main line after knight to C3, bishop down to B4. This is the winner variation. We did a chess opening video on this. So if you haven't seen that, if you're not familiar with the French defense, definitely go check that video out. I'll have the link below just so if you want to do some prep work as far as this opening, you can do that. But play continues with E5, pawn down here to C5. And then after A3, forcing the bishop to go somewhere, decides to go ahead and take the material. Pawn recaptures right here. So white does have double pawns on the C file. Not as bad when it's towards the center of the board and it's connected. It'd be much worse if this pawn was not here. But this does open up for a semi-open file for the rook to come here to B1 at some point, control this open B file. You can usually tell where the attack's going to be, where the pawns are pointed. So you can see that these pawns right here are aimed at this king side of the board. So putting a lot of pressure, look to be attacking on the king side. It limits some of the squares. This pawn here on E5, the knight can't come to his natural square of knight to F6. It's going to be coming to E7, which is exactly where it comes. Black's really going to be looking to overwhelm on the queen side of the board. White's going to be looking to attack on the king side of the board. A fairly novel move from MVL, and he starts out with H4. I usually see in this variation queen to G4, attacking this pawn here on G7, or just getting the knight here to F3. Both of those seem logical to me. He plays H4, and then queen to C7, which is the natural way to attack this. And then we see H5 continue to push on the king side. And I'm not sure what was more surprising as I saw this, the move H5 or H6. The main reason that you play queen to C7 is that if they play something like H5, then you can take with your pawn here on D4. And then after they take, you can come down and check right here. Queen to C3 check. They play bishop to D2, makes a lot of sense. And then you can take right here. Maybe knight to F3, queen to E4. Those all seem pretty logical to me. Maybe bishop to E2, knight to F5. Black has a pretty good position here. But instead, we see just H6. So I think instead of H5, if he wanted to play knight to F3, I mean, I know there's a lot of preparation that went into this, but usually I would expect to see after the queen to C7, something like knight to F3. But he's going all in. H5, and then we see Jan try to stop that with H6. Rook to B1, attacking the semi-open file as we talked about before. B6, just solidifying the queen side pawn chain here. Queen to G4, so now starting to attack that king side of the board. Rook to G8, defending that. Bishop to B5, check, trying to get as much material involved into the action as possible. King comes over here to F8. Couldn't castle anyway. The rook had already moved, so don't have to worry too much. Wants to protect the king side. Has both his rook and his king defending it right now. Bishop comes back to D3. And then bishop to a6 says, yeah, we can exchange material if you want to. First, we have some pawns come off the board. And then after the pawns recapture here, you can see that white no longer has the double pawns. Now, he has a backward pawn here on c3 that he may have to worry about at some point. But he has been able to get rid of the double pawns here on the c file. Now, both sides, they have the open b file. So at some point, you're going to expect to see a rook come here to b8. You don't want your opponent to just openly control that b file here. First, we see the queen come back here to d1, just preparing to swing over to the queen side of the board. Queen to a5, attacking both the backward pawn here on c3, which is very open right now. White definitely needs to defend that, as the king would be exposed to that as well, and also wants to attack this pawn here on a3. So a lot of threats that black has. We see the bishop come here to d2, stopping this immediate threat here on c3. Rook to b8, knight up here to f2. Now we could have, if we wanted to, see the queen take on a3, but then knight to e2. Don't know that it really matters too much for black. I thought he may have decided to take that pawn, but in the game decided to just bring his rook over here to b8. Now knight to e2, as we talked about, pawn to c4. So really pushing. You can see where these pawns are pointing. They're pointed towards the queen side or the board. And so that's where black's going to be looking to attack. As we already mentioned, white's going to be looking to attack on the king side of the board. We do see white castle, so getting his king in safety here. It's going to be a while before Jan can actually attack the white king. Rook to b6 just says, yeah, if white's going to take my material here, I don't want to be exchanging and bringing my knight back here to b8. So now rook to b6. If there ever is an exchange, now the knight can take here. The pawn can take here if he wants to. Even the queen can take, but it's in a much better position than back here on b8. So after rook to b6, we see queen to c2. Just wants to be a little more centralized, still maintaining some presence on the queen side of the board, still protecting this pawn here on c3, as well as the bishop and the knight, but then also allows the rook or the queen to swing over here to something like h7 if there ever is a potential threat to pose on the opponent. Rook to h8 does not want to even worry about the queen coming over here to h7. And then we see queen or pawn to a4, still protected by the queen, so it can start to push up a little bit on the board. King to e8, rook to b4. And then knight to c6, attacking the rook here on b4. And here's where things get pretty interesting. It really felt like we were going to see this rook maybe exchange material here on the queen side of the board, or just come back and say, yeah, we will fight another day here. MVL says, you're attacking my rook? Don't care. Pawn to f4. Oh baby, it is time to start the attack on the king side. Says, I don't care if you take this material. And Jan seemed to be taken aback by this, because he didn't even take this material, which I think he absolutely could have. Knight takes here, pawn recaptures, attacking the queen. Maybe queen back here to a6, pawn b5, and then the queen swings back, bishop to a5, attacking the rook. Although honestly, as I was looking at it, and I think b5 makes a lot of sense, you could just see full YOLO with f5 and just throw everything at the king side and say, I'm not even going to attack the queen. Just do what you want. Don't really know what would have happened if we saw the knight take here on b4. But in the game, we see the knight come back here to e7. So it seems like Jan's looking at the board and senses a big threat coming from MVL. So wants to stop any sort of shenanigans with f5. So not worried about the rook too much right now. More worried about the king side of the board. Rook swings over to b1. Says, yeah, if you want to take my rook, I'm going to have some protection right there. And then f5. So making sure that the pawn can't push up any further. We do see rook to b5, attacking the queen. Queen comes back here to a6. Bishop to c1. Recognizing, hey, bishop's not doing too much. Let's go ahead and maneuver it over here to the a3 squares to start to attack my opponent here. King to f7, bishop a3, rook over here to b8, and then the bishop takes on e7. Now, at the beginning of the game, you're usually not going to see bishops trading off with a knight. You like to hold on to your bishops in an open game, meaning there's not a lot of pawns in the center of the board. Once the pawns comes off the board, or once the pawns are off the board, bishops are better. But once they're just clogging up the center, bishops don't do as well. And so really good observation by MVL to maneuver his bishop, recognizing it's not doing too much, but this knight on e7 is maneuvering over the board and controlling a lot of what white's trying to do. So MVL says, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and trade off my piece that's not doing too much for your piece that is extremely active. King recaptures on e7, and then we start to see the push here with g4. Rook takes here on b5, so we finally see the exchange. Now we do see the pawn on b5 had an option as far as how he wanted to retake, but decides to take with his pawn here. Rook takes, pawn takes here on f5. Rook takes down here on b1, queen comes back and recaptures, and then the pawn takes. So interesting dynamic that we have here. Black has 6 pawns, white has 5 pawns. Both sides have a pass pawn. Right here we have the pawn here on e5 as a pass pawn, as well as this pawn here on a7. But white has a pretty good setup. He also has a fairly safe king right here on g1. And there's some backward pawns that white can easily start to attack. So it's going to be interesting getting into the endgame. Although black is up material, I almost like white's position a little bit more. First, we see knight to g3 attacking the pawn here on f5. Probably better to do this than just taking up here with queen takes on f5. Then queen over here to e6. I just don't like this position as much. When we see knight to g3 attacking the pawn, if the queen were to come over here right now, the knight can still take here. It's protected by this queen here on b1. So knight to g3, pretty safe to get the material back and even the material for both sides of the board. Queen to b6, attacking the queen right here, but can still freely take exactly as he does here on f5. Check. King comes back here to f8. Don't want to try anything. Obviously can't come to d6 or f6 because of the pawns. But you can't just come to e6 because then you're going to see knight to g7 check, and then maybe the king comes back, and then the queen swings up here to h7. It's just all sort of just bad news for black. So if we come back a few moves in the game after the knight comes up here to f5, then we see the king come back here to f8. Now queen to a1. Queen over here to e6, knight comes back to g3, and then queen g4. Now this is pinning down the knights, but after the king comes to g2, black just doesn't have a lot of threats on the board. Yes, he can take this material right here, but after that, how does he really continue where white has some pretty strong attacks? So after queen takes on f4, which is exactly what happened in the game, queen takes on a7, and all of a sudden white has the only pass pawn, and he's going to start to push that on the board. And that is a major advantage, especially getting into the endgame. And you have your queen back here that can help support that. So king to e7, protecting the knight here on d7. Queen to a3 check. King comes back here, d8. And then queen to d6. The final nail in the coffin. There's no way for black to really come back from this. The knight's being pinned down. Pawn pushing forward here to e6. Going to be the next move. There's no way to stop that. Jan tries starting with g5. But then we see en passant capturing. Now white has 2 pass pawns. h5. And then after g7 realizes, okay, this is all bad news. There's just no way to stop this. So at the end of it, Jan decides to resign, and MVL gets the victory and now is tied. Coming into the game, needed a full point and got exactly that. Jan looking for the draw and win for the French defense, which generally speaking is a pretty drawish game. But white navigated very well and ended up with the victory. So we have 2 players tied at the top now, and it's the ones we just looked at, MVL as well as Jan. So hopefully you guys enjoy this video. I always like to watch a good e4 opening take down the French defense, but hopefully you guys have enjoyed round 7. We are halfway through the tournament, so there's a lot of chess to be played. But I appreciate you guys tuning in to all of the videos, and we will be back tomorrow for round number 8.